So Resident Evil is one of my favorite horror games of all time, if you couldn't notice that already. And people always ask me, why do I love this game so much? Well, it's because it was one of my first horror games I've ever played. Though I played the so-called worst version of the bunch according to most of the community. So that's when I did some research on this to figure out why people hate RE6 so much. To no one's surprise, I came across an article stating the obvious that RE6 could never decide if it was a survival horror or an action game. So this made me beg the question, what is survival horror and how did it evolve into action horror? As I took my first step, I bumped my head already in disbelief. No matter how much I searched for the official definition of survival horror, there wasn't one. How could such a famous subgenre of horror not have its own definition? Or so I thought till I came across an article by this dude that states, a good way you can classify a game as survival horror is to see how well it focuses on the survival part. Survival consists of things like limited resources, incredibly dangerous enemies, areas that reward exploration, and inventory management. Essentially, the variables you need to manage and choices you need to make to ensure your survival. At first, this sounds fine on its own, but from my personal experience, what makes horror games different from each other isn't just about like it's mixed in genre, which right now it's survival horror. It's also about how the game scares you. What do I mean by this? Well, horror is supposed to invoke fear, shock, or disgust in their audience. Think of it like a horror movie. You wouldn't put Saw and Halloween in the same category because the purposes of those movies are vastly different from each other. For example, in Saw, there's a lot more emphasis in gore or the amount of violence shown on screen. And this is supposed to make the viewer feel disgusted. But because Halloween isn't as bloody as Saw, it doesn't mean it isn't a horror movie. So how does Halloween scare us? Well, it plays on the fear of being stalked by someone. Now going back to video games, it's the same thing. So survival horror scares the player by making the player feel just fear. So with all of that in mind, survival horror to me is a slow-paced game that mostly focuses on your intellectual skill by solving puzzles and using other means to pass through the horrors blocking your path. Though you can use weapons to defend yourself from the enemies directly, most of the time you don't have to unless it's a scripted boss fight. And as a side note, I said defend yourself from the enemies directly in scripted boss fights so you don't get confused with stealth horror. And if you don't know, stealth horror is exactly like survival horror, but you can't in any way hurt your opponent. Examples of stealth horror games are Outlast, Amnesia, and my personal favorite, Haunting Ground. Now that we have defined what survival horror is, where did it originate? Well, according to this person, most gamers' first real exposure to what we consider the template for modern horror was the original Resident Evil or perhaps Silent Hill. However, even those games had clear influences. One was a somewhat obscure Japanese game called Sweet Home, but in terms of 3D horror, Alone in the Dark was an experience like nothing else. In other words, Alone in the Dark came out before Resident Evil in 1992. Which makes it the first survival horror game. I say this because Alone in the Dark fits perfectly with my definition unlike Sweet Home. Even though the latter was a role-playing game, it was what inspired the settings of Resident Evil in 1996. So then why does society think Resident Evil was the first survival horror and not Alone in the Dark? Well, that's because it came out at the wrong time. Because during the 90s, most people didn't have access to computers since they were just way too expensive, so they played at arcade machines. Or they knew about the game through commercials, which Alone in the Dark did not even do that, and was only available on computer. Now, why Capcom stuck with action horror till RE7 in 2017 is a mystery in itself, since RE5 and 6 went downhill in popularity because of the excessive attention to the shooting boom bang bang. A game similar to these games is the famous misclassified horror Left 4 Dead 2009. When looking up this game on any console and PC, it says it's a survival horror, but by my definition, it doesn't qualify for that. The gameplay is much more centered around fast-paced action rather than the slow but tense survival. Sure, it has aspects of it like limited resources and inventory management, but that all depends on how skilled the player is. Though in contrast to that idea, this dude argues that Dead Space and Left 4 Dead are the purest sort of survival horror, because emphasizing combat naturally emphasizes survival horror. Although I do partially agree in what he says, I would still say Left 4 Dead is mostly an action horror with survival aspects sprinkled in it. Dead Space is also an action horror since it does exactly what Resident Evil 4 does, just in space. So in other words, those games should be categorized as action horror, though they also can be called action survival horror if you combine his statement with mine. Now, even though these games are great in their own right, by the time 2010 started, survival horror games as we know it were slowly dying out by society's thirst for a quick dose of an adrenaline rush, which is provided only by games in the action category. Call of Duty, Destiny, Halo, etc. But on the bright side, the somewhat end of survival horror led to famous action horror games including The Last of Us, The Evil Within, and Dying Light. Though Resident Evil 7 tried to revive the genre from the dead, no other company or games that are survival horror have made it to the spotlight in the mainstream media as of 2022. And because of the confusion of what makes a game a survival horror, the majority think that the genre hasn't gone out just yet. But unfortunately, as much as I want the genre to stay, most newbies can't handle losing control. Though remakes are for the new generation of players, I still think actually new survival horror games are not being created. It is because a remake is just an update for a better graphics and convenient availability of an old game. There's nothing wrong with remakes, because look, I play a Resident Evil 3 remake and I think it's awesome. But it makes me think that game developers have been getting lazy in their current creativity department. Or it might be that the devs that are making those games aren't getting enough support by their community, like Alyssa, for example. But alas, the choice comes down to you to decide on what you think survival horror is, since at the end of the day, it's just a theory. A game theory.